At some point in the 1980s, Wayne Newton was pulling in $250,000 a week. He owned a 52-acre palace in the Nevada desert, Arabian horses, vintage cars, a gold microphone that had once belonged to Frank Sinatra. And then the courts reduced all of it to nothing. Not in one sudden blow, but in layers, through lawsuits, bankruptcy filings, and a real estate transaction so improbable it reads like a mistake in a screenplay. The home he spent 5 decades constructing was sold to someone else for less than he himself had offered to buy it back. How does the highest-paid entertainer in the world end up signing bankruptcy papers with $20 million in debt? What really happened to the lawsuit that should have paid him $19.2 million? And why did that money never come? And what drives a man at 84 years old, after everything the city took from him, to keep walking out onto a Las Vegas stage every single week? The answers are not what most people expect. But before we get there, we have to go back to the beginning, to a boy from Virginia who could barely breathe, and who somehow found the most enduring voice Las Vegas has ever known. There is a version of this story that starts with the lights. The marquee lights of Las Vegas blazing white and gold against the Nevada desert sky, spelling out a name that would become as synonymous with that city as neon itself. The version where a boy from nothing walked into the most glamorous city on earth and never left. Where 30,000 shows became the measure of a life. Where $250,000 a week was not a dream but a Tuesday. That version is true. But it is not where the story begins. The story begins in Norfolk, Virginia, in the spring of 1942, in a household with no marquee lights, no neon, no guarantee of anything. A mechanic's son, a boy who could not breathe properly, a child whose lungs filled with fluid in the Virginia humidity until every morning became a negotiation between his body and the simple act of staying alive. Asthma so severe that doctors told his parents the climate itself was working against him, that the only solution was to leave, to find somewhere drier, warmer, more forgiving, to a boy whose chest tightened like a vice every time the seasons turned. What those doctors in Norfolk in 1942 could not possibly have calculated was that the medical advice uprooting this family from everything they knew would eventually place their son on the greatest entertainment stage the 20th century ever produced. But that was still years away, and the road between Norfolk and Las Vegas was longer and harder than any marquee light could illuminate. Before the road, there was the music. There is always the music. Wayne Newton did not discover music the way most children do. Gradually, tentatively, through lessons and recitals and the patient encouragement of teachers. He absorbed it the way other children absorb language. Naturally, completely, with a totality that suggested the notes had always lived inside him, and that the instruments were simply the means of letting them out. By the age of 6, without any formal instruction, he had taught himself to play 13 instruments, not adequately, not passably, but proficiently. Piano, guitar, steel guitar, banjo, trumpet, and others. Each one yielding its secrets to a boy who seemed to speak their language fluently from the first moment his fingers touched them. He had perfect pitch, the kind that cannot be taught, only discovered. The kind that meant he heard the world differently from everyone around him, that every sound carried information others simply could not process. Before he was old enough for most children to walk to school on their own, Wayne Newton already had his own radio program in Norfolk. Not a children's slot. A real program broadcast to real listeners, where a boy played steel guitar and sang country music with a conviction that made people stop what they were doing and listen. On weekends, he and his older brother Jerry performed in the traveling road show of the Grand Ole Opry, moving from town to town with the confidence of professionals twice their age and the hunger of children who had already understood something most adults spend their entire lives trying to learn. That the stage is not something you stand on. It is something you become. And then the lungs said no. The family listened to the doctors. Norfolk became a memory. The road west began, carrying a mechanic's son and his impossible gift toward a desert that did not yet know his name. He could not have known what was waiting. Nobody could have known. All he knew was that somewhere ahead, past the Virginia humidity and the Ohio clubs and the Arizona dry heat that finally let him breathe without fighting for every lungful, there was a city built entirely on reinvention, populated by people who had come from nothing and constructed themselves into something under lights so bright they erased every shadow. He was going to fit right in. He just did not yet know what it would cost him to stay. He arrived in Las Vegas at 17 years old with no money, no connections, and no plan beyond the absolute certainty that if there was any city on earth made for someone like him, this was it. Las Vegas in 1959 was not yet the city it would become. The Strip was still finding its shape. The desert between the casinos was more present than the casinos themselves. There were no mega resorts, no convention centers, no theme park hotels stretching 40 floors into the Nevada sky. What existed in abundance was appetite. An entire city built on the premise that entertainment was not a luxury but a necessity, that the human desire to be dazzled was as fundamental as hunger, and that the right performer in the right room could transform a crowd of strangers into something that felt, for 2 hours at least, like a congregation. Wayne Newton walked into that city and understood it immediately, not intellectually but instinctively. The way a musician senses a key change before it resolves. The way a performer feels the room shift before the audience knows it has shifted. Las Vegas was not a place he had to learn. It was a place he recognized. Within months of arriving, he and his brother Jerry were performing at the Fremont Hotel. Not as opening acts, not as filler between the headliners, but as headliners themselves. Two brothers from Virginia, one barely old enough to vote, holding a Las Vegas showroom with a command that left audiences and management alike searching for the right word to describe what they were witnessing. The word was inevitability. There are performers who work their way to greatness through years of accumulated craft. Each performance a small deposit in a long account that eventually reaches a sum worth calling a legacy. And then there are performers who arrive already carrying something that cannot be taught, cannot be rehearsed, cannot be manufactured by any combination of coaching and discipline and effort. Something that either exists in a person or does not. Wayne Newton had it from the very first night. By 1963, Danke schön had entered the American consciousness. A German phrase meaning, "thank you kindly," delivered in a voice that somehow managed to be simultaneously powerful and intimate, formal and warm. The voice of a showman and the voice of a man genuinely grateful for the attention of every single person in every single room he ever entered. The song became his signature the way certain songs become inseparable from the people who sing them, not merely associated with their names, but fused to their identities at a molecular level. You could not hear Danke schön without thinking of Wayne Newton. And increasingly, you could not think of Las Vegas without thinking of both. The residencies multiplied. The crowds grew. The fees escalated with a momentum that reflected not only his popularity but his absolute reliability as a performer. Wayne Newton did not cancel. Wayne Newton did not have bad nights. Wayne Newton did not give an audience less than everything he had simply because the house was half full, or the piano was slightly out of tune, or the lighting was not quite right. He gave everything every night, with a consistency that became its own form of legend in a city that had seen enough performers to understand how rare that quality truly was. By the late 1970s, he was not merely a Las Vegas fixture. He was a Las Vegas institution, the kind that a city builds its identity around. The kind whose name on a marquee carries a guarantee not just of entertainment but of experience, of being in the presence of someone who has mastered not only the technical demands of performance, but the deeper, less quantifiable art of making every person in the room feel that the show was somehow being given specifically for them. Frank Sinatra, who did not distribute praise carelessly, called him the greatest entertainer he had ever seen. That is not a small thing. Coming from Sinatra, it is almost an impossible thing. And yet nobody who had watched Wayne Newton work a Las Vegas showroom in those years would have disputed the assessment. In 1983, the numbers confirmed what the rooms already knew. Wayne Newton became the highest-paid entertainer in the world, $250,000 a week. A figure so staggering it was reported not just in entertainment publications but in financial ones. A figure that seemed to place him beyond the reach of ordinary misfortune. A figure that suggested a man so thoroughly rewarded by his talent and his city that nothing could touch him. A figure that, as it turned out, meant almost nothing at all when the wrong enemy decided to come for him. Because while Wayne Newton was standing at the absolute peak of everything he had built, a television network in New York was preparing a report that would not simply challenge his reputation. It would set in motion a chain of events that would cost him more than any bankruptcy filing could ever fully express. It would cost him the thing that no accountant can measure and no lawyer can recover. It would cost him years. And in this business, years are the only currency that cannot be earned back. It began with a report, not a scandal caught on camera, not a crime witnessed by credible witnesses, not even an allegation with a name attached to it and evidence to support it. It began with a television network, a story, and a decision made in an editorial room far from Las Vegas by people who did not know Wayne Newton, had never watched him work a room, and had no particular interest in what the truth cost a man whose name they were about to attach to one of the most damaging accusations available in the American imagination. In 1980, NBC broadcast a report suggesting that Wayne Newton had connections to organized crime, specifically, that his efforts to purchase the Aladdin Hotel in Las Vegas had involved partnerships with figures linked to the Carlo Gambino crime family. The report named Guido Penosi, an alleged mob associate, as someone Newton had ties to. The report did not prove these connections. It asserted them. It placed them before a national television audience with the authority that network news carried in 1980, an authority that functioned as something close to a verdict in the court of public opinion, regardless of what any actual court might eventually determine. Wayne Newton's response was immediate and unequivocal. He sued NBC for defamation, not because it was the strategically wise decision, not because his lawyers told him it was the path of least resistance, but because the allegation was, in his own words, ridiculous, because he was, in his own words, an Indian boy from Virginia who knew nothing about the mafia. Because there are men who absorb an injustice, calculate the cost of fighting it against the cost of enduring it, and choose the quieter path. And then there are men who cannot make that calculation, not because they are irrational, but because their sense of who they are will not permit them to let a lie go unchallenged simply because challenging it is expensive. Wayne Newton was the second kind of man. The legal battle that followed consumed years, not months, but years. Years of depositions and court appearances and legal fees that accumulated with a relentlessness that the original $250,000 a week, enormous as it was, could not indefinitely absorb. Years during which the allegation hung over every performance, every contract negotiation, every business conversation. A shadow that his talent and his crowds could not entirely dispel. And then, in December of 1986, Wayne Newton won. A federal jury awarded him $19.2 million, the largest defamation verdict ever returned against a news organization in American history, with $5 million of it in punitive damages alone. A verdict so significant it was reported across the country not just as a legal outcome, but as a cultural event. A moment in which a man who had been told his reputation was worth nothing proved in the most public forum available that it was worth nearly $20 million. He had won. Except that he had not, because the appeals court that reviewed the verdict in 1990 did not see what the jury had seen. The appellate judges overturned the award. The $19.2 million evaporated. The legal fees did not. The years of litigation did not. The ulcer Newton had developed during the legal battle, the physical manifestation of what it costs a body to carry that weight for that long, did not disappear with the reversal of the verdict. What remained was the debt. Enormous, structural, inescapable debt. The kind that does not respond to talent or willpower or the size of the crowds that still filled every room he played. The kind that exists independently of everything a man can do on a stage. The kind that a bankruptcy court is specifically designed to address, because it represents a situation that performance alone cannot resolve. In August of 1992, Wayne Newton filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The filing listed $20 million in debt, $8.3 million owed to a single bank in Pennsylvania, $1.22 million to General Electric Credit, $300,000 to 7 different law firms, $341,000 in back taxes owed to the IRS, and then the smaller entries, the ones that somehow carried their own particular weight precisely because of their ordinariness. A debt on a Cadillac, $32,000 in hay for the horses at Casa de Shenandoah. The daily costs of a life built on the assumption that the money would always be there, itemized in a federal court document for anyone to read. The man who had been the highest-paid entertainer in the world 2 years earlier was now cataloging what he owed on horse feed in a bankruptcy filing. It was not the money that broke something. It was the distance between what the numbers had once said about his life and what the documents were now saying, the distance between the marquee and the courthouse, between Danke Schoen and a $341,000 IRS lien. He did not disappear. That is the first thing to understand about Wayne Newton in the wake of the bankruptcy. He did not retreat. He did not cancel his shows. He did not withdraw from Las Vegas or from the public, or from the stage that had been his entire identity since he was 17 years old and walked into the Fremont Hotel with nothing but a voice and the certainty that he belonged there. He performed night after night in the same city that now knew the details of his financial ruin, to crowds that came anyway, because whatever the bankruptcy filing said about his bank accounts, they said nothing about what happened when the lights came up and Wayne Newton walked onto a stage and gave everything he had to the people who had paid to be in the room with him. By 1999, 7 years after the filing, he had rebuilt enough of a financial foundation to be described as solvent again. A 1999 contract with the Stardust Hotel, 10 years, 6 shows a week, 40 weeks a year, represented a stability that the bankruptcy years had made feel almost miraculous. He had climbed back, but the IRS had not finished with him. In 2005, federal agents claimed Newton and his wife owed $1.8 million in taxes and penalties from 1997 through 2000. Unreported income, improperly claimed deductions, the machinery of federal tax enforcement grinding over a man who had already survived one financial catastrophe and was being asked to survive the mechanisms of a second. His lawyers disputed the figures, claiming the IRS actually owed Newton money in unclaimed deductions. The dispute resolved eventually the way these disputes tend to resolve, quietly, without the drama of the original allegation. But the pattern was becoming visible. Not a pattern of recklessness or irresponsibility, a pattern of a man whose relationship with money was structurally misaligned with the demands the world kept placing on it. A man whose instinct was always to fight, always to perform, always to build bigger and spend more and give more and trust that the talent that had never failed him on a stage would somehow translate into the kind of financial invulnerability that talent, as it turns out, does not actually provide. Casa de Shenandoah was still standing, still magnificent, still the 52-acre testament to everything Wayne Newton had built across the decades of his career. Still home to the Arabian horses and the exotic animals and the vintage cars and the private jet and the memorabilia from Sinatra and Elvis and the 100 other friends and colleagues, whose signatures and gifts lined the walls of a mansion that felt less like a house and more like a museum dedicated to the proposition that a mechanic's son from Norfolk, Virginia had fully and completely arrived. It was still there. For now. There are losses that can be measured in dollars. And then there are losses that can only be measured in what a place meant to the person who built it, what it represented, what it held inside its walls that no appraisal, no bankruptcy filing, no court document could ever accurately capture. Casa de Shenandoah was not simply Wayne Newton's home. It was the physical autobiography of his life. Every acre purchased with earnings from stages he had dominated. Every horse in those 53 stalls chosen with the care of a man who understood that the animals he kept were a reflection of the standards he held for everything else. Every piece of memorabilia on those walls a token from someone who had recognized in him something worth acknowledging. Frank Sinatra's gold microphone. A letter in Elvis Presley's handwriting. The private jet that had carried him between the city that claimed him and the rest of a world that wanted pieces of him. 52 acres of desert transformed over decades of intention and investment into something that had no equivalent anywhere in Las Vegas and very few equivalents anywhere in the world. He had built it from nothing, from 5 acres purchased in 1966 by a young man who was already performing but not yet legendary, who looked at a vacant patch of Nevada desert and saw not what it was but what it could become, given enough time and enough resources and enough of the relentless forward-moving energy that had characterized every decision of his life since the first night he walked onto a Las Vegas stage and understood with absolute clarity that this was where he belonged. It had taken decades to become what it became. It took considerably less time to lose. The trouble began, as so much of the trouble in Wayne Newton's financial life began, not with excess or negligence, but with a partnership that seemed sound at the outset and revealed its instabilities only after the commitments were already made. In 2012, CSD LLC, the business entity that had partnered with Newton to transform Casa de Shenandoah into a public attraction, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection of its own. The filing initiated a legal process that Newton had no power to stop. A bankruptcy court judge, applying the provisions of federal law with the impartiality federal law requires, approved the sale of Casa de Shenandoah. The property was valued at $50.8 million. It was listed for sale at $70 million in 2013, then reduced to $30 million in 2014. Newton and his family moved out. They relocated to a pair of houses worth a combined $5 million, a mile down the road from the palace they had just left. Close enough to see the gates, far enough that the gates no longer opened for them. He said later that by the time they left, he had had enough of the toll it was taking on his family, that he would never back down from a fight, but that when they left Shenandoah he felt relieved. That word, relieved, coming from a man who had built that property acre by acre, room by room, horse by horse over nearly 5 decades, carries a weight the word itself can barely hold. It is the word of a man who has been fighting for so long that the end of the fight, even when the end means losing, feels like the first full breath in years. The property sat on the market. The tours that eventually opened in September of 2015, with Newton's involvement under the ownership of Lacy Harbor, the Texas businessman who had purchased the estate, brought the public inside the gates for the first time in 30 years. Within 5 days of opening, 400 people a day were walking through the rooms that Wayne Newton had filled over 5 decades with the artifacts of a life lived at the absolute center of American entertainment. He was there every day, visiting the property he no longer owned, walking among the horses, speaking to visitors, conducting himself by all accounts with the same graciousness and generosity that had defined every public interaction of his career, as though the fact that the deed to the land bore someone else's name was simply a technicality that his relationship with the place could absorb. And then, in July of 2017, a spider bit him. Not a metaphor, not a complication, an actual spider on the grounds of the property he had built that put him in the hospital in critical condition. The tours that had been running successfully for nearly 2 years slowed and then stopped. By May of 2018, the property closed to the public. By July of 2018, it had returned to private residence status. The gates that had briefly opened to the world swung shut again. In 2019, Lacy Harbor sold Casa de Shenandoah to Smoketree LLC for $5.56 million. $5,560,000. For 52 acres. For the mansion. For the stables. For the car museum. For the koi ponds and the tennis courts and the heliport and the private jet terminal. For the property that had been appraised at $50.8 million just 7 years earlier and listed at $70 million just 6 years earlier. $5.56 million. And before that sale was finalized, Wayne Newton had made his move. He had offered $6 million to buy back the home he had built. He had believed, based on conversations, on assurances, on the reasonable expectation that a man offering $6 million for a property listed at less than $6 million would be the buyer, that he had an agreement. He did not have an agreement. The property was sold to Smoketree for nearly $500,000 less than Newton had offered. Read that again. The property was sold to someone else for less money than Wayne Newton had offered to pay for it. It was not about the money. $6 million, in the context of a life that had generated hundreds of millions, was not the number that mattered. What mattered was the unmistakable clarity of what that transaction communicated. That the home he had built, the home he had fought to keep, the home he had moved back into and then been forced out of again, the home he had tried to buy back at a price higher than what it eventually sold for, was gone. Not because he had not tried. Not because he had not offered enough. But because the machinery of ownership and debt and legal obligation had moved in a direction that his offer, his history, his half-century of connection to that land could not redirect. He was a mile down the road. The gates that bore his name no longer opened when he approached them. In 2020, Smoketree listed Casa de Shenandoah for sale at $29.9 million. As of 2026, the property remains in private hands, closed to the public, its future uncertain, its past indelibly and permanently the story of one man who built something extraordinary in the Nevada desert and could not, in the end, hold on to it. What Smoketree owns is the land and the structure. What they cannot own is what happened inside those walls for 50 years. That belongs to Wayne Newton. It always will. And perhaps that is the cruelest truth of this entire chapter. Not that he lost the property, but that the loss came so close to being reversed. That he came within the margin of a single transaction to getting back the home that defined his life. And that margin was not his failure. It was simply fate, operating with the indifference that fate reserves for the moments when its decisions will hurt the most. He said he felt relieved when they left the first time. He did not say what he felt when the second door closed. Some things do not have words. They only have the silence that follows when a man who has spent his entire life filling rooms with sound has nothing left to say. There is a question that hangs over everything this story has covered. Not the financial question. Not the legal one. Not even the question of what Casa de Shenandoah represents in the longer arc of a life built, and partially dismantled, and rebuilt in the Nevada desert over the course of 6 decades. The question is simpler than all of those and harder. Why is he still here? Not here in the geographic sense. Las Vegas is the only answer to that question. It has always been the only answer. It will always be the only answer for a man whose identity and the identity of this city became so thoroughly intertwined across 60-plus years that separating them would require dismantling something fundamental in both. He is here because this is where he belongs. That has never been in question. The deeper question is why, after everything the city and the industry and the legal system and the financial machinery of American entertainment put him through, he is still performing, still walking onto stages, still giving everything he has to rooms full of people who came to see what 84 years of living and performing and losing and rebuilding actually looks like when it stands in front of a microphone and opens its mouth and begins to sing. The truest answer, when you have sat with this story long enough, is not complicated. It is just true. Wayne Newton performs because performing is not something he does. It is something he is. It was something he was before Las Vegas knew his name. Before Danky Shone entered the American consciousness. Before the marquee lights spelled out a name that would become as permanent a feature of this city's identity as the neon itself. It was something he was at 6 years old in Norfolk, Virginia, sitting at a piano that had not asked to be mastered and mastering it anyway. It was something he was at 17, walking into the Fremont Hotel with nothing but a voice and the certainty that the stage was not a place he was visiting, but a place he was returning to. The bankruptcies did not change that. The lawsuits did not change that. The IRS did not change that. The spider did not change that. The sale of Casa de Shenandoah to a buyer who paid less for it than Newton had offered did not change that. None of it changed the fundamental, irreducible fact that when Wayne Newton stands on a stage and the lights come up and the room goes quiet with that particular quality of quiet that exists only in the moment before a performer of genuine magnitude begins. Something happens that no court document, no bankruptcy filing, and no property transaction has ever been able to touch. At 84 years old, he still performs his up-close and personal show in Las Vegas. Still appears before audiences who come not out of nostalgia alone, though nostalgia is present, but out of something more durable, the recognition that what they are witnessing is not a relic, but a continuation. Not the echo of something that once was, but the living, present reality of a man who has outlasted his own defeats and is still, against every reasonable expectation, giving everything he has to every room he enters. His net worth in 2026 sits at an estimated $50 million, a substantial figure by any ordinary measure, and a shadow of the peak wealth that once approached $120 million. A testament to both the scale of what was lost and the scale of what was recovered, rebuilt, and sustained across decades of relentless, uninterrupted performance. He has a wife who has stood beside him through the years that would have ended most partnerships. A daughter, Lauren, born in 2002, who grew up in the houses near the gates that no longer opened and who carries in her name the legacy of a man who built something magnificent and held on to the parts of it that matter most. The horses are still part of his life, the Arabian horses that were always more than an investment, more than a symbol of wealth, more than a collector's indulgence. They were, for a man who spent his entire adult life performing for other people's pleasure, one of the few things he kept entirely for himself. A connection to something that predated the marquee lights and would, he always seemed to sense, outlast them. Las Vegas in 2026 is a city that has changed almost beyond recognition from the place a 17-year-old from Norfolk walked into in 1959. The Strip he knew is buried under 50 layers of reinvention. The hotels he headlined have been demolished or transformed. The era he defined has been catalogued, celebrated, and in some quarters already begun to be forgotten by a city that has always been more interested in what is coming next than in what came before. And yet his name remains, on marquees, in memories, in the consciousness of a city that has produced legends by the dozens across the decades and knows, somewhere in its neon-lit institutional memory, which ones were real. He is one of the real ones. He always was. What this story asks you to carry with you, as the lights come up and the music fades and you return to whatever version of ordinary life exists on the other side of 60 years of extraordinary living, is not pity. Wayne Newton has never asked for pity and would not accept it if offered. What it asks is recognition. Recognition that the distance between the highest-paid entertainer in the world and a bankruptcy filing with $20 million in debt is not a moral distance. It is not a distance measured in character or integrity or the quality of the work. It is a distance measured in the particular cruelty of a legal system that can strip years and money from a man defending his own name and leave him with nothing but the bill for having tried. Recognition that losing a home you built with your own earnings over 5 decades, losing it to a buyer who paid less for it than you offered to pay to get it back, is a loss that no subsequent financial recovery fully erases. And recognition that a man who absorbs all of that and walks back onto a Las Vegas stage and gives everything he has to the people in the room is not performing in spite of what happened to him. He is performing because of it. Because the stage was always the one place where none of it could reach him. Where the debt and the lawsuits and the lost property and the spider bite and the IRS and the court documents and the financial machinery that ground through the work of 60 years and left $50 million where there had once been $120 million. Where none of it existed. Where there was only the music, where there was only the room, where there was only Wayne Newton, 84 years old, still wearing the suits, still commanding the stage, still giving everything he has to every person who came to be in his presence, still here, still standing, still performing. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself somewhere in the distance between what Wayne Newton built and what he lost and what he chose to do anyway, leave a comment below. Tell us what part of this journey stayed with you. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about what it looks like to refuse to let the worst chapters define the whole book, share this video with them now. Because that is what Wayne Newton's story is at its core. Not a cautionary tale. Not a tragedy. A testimony. Subscribe to Golden Fame News for more stories like this one, told with the depth and the honesty they deserve. We will see you in the next one.